Jack Hawkins had everything: a towering empire of glass and steel, power, and influence. To the world, he was the king of Wall Street, a man who built his own destiny. But behind closed doors, his personal life was unraveling. Hannah, his wife, had once been the love of his life. Their relationship had started like a fairy tale: romantic surprises, whispered promises, and dreams of a bright future together. But over time, Jack became obsessed with his career. Meetings, deals, and late nights at the office took precedence over dinner dates and weekend getaways. Hannah, once the center of his world, was now an afterthought. The final blow came on what was supposed to be an important day for both of them. Hannah had been waiting at a fancy restaurant, her hands resting on her belly, a secret growing inside her, a child she had yet to tell Jack about. She had rehearsed the moment over and over, imagining his reaction, his excitement. But Jack never showed up. Instead, Hannah saw him walk into the mall, laughing with another woman, Melissa, the new executive at his company. Their closeness was undeniable. The way Melissa touched his arm, the way he leaned in when she spoke, it was enough to confirm Hannah's worst fears. Gathering all her courage, she confronted him. "Jack," she called, her voice trembling. He turned, his expression flickering with surprise, then irritation. "Hannah, what are you doing here?" She swallowed hard. "We had lunch planned. Don't you remember?" Jack shrugged. "Must have slipped my mind. I'm busy." Melissa smirked, her voice dripping with condescension. "Oh, honey, don't you get it? Jack has more important things to do than have lunch with a housewife." Hannah's heart shattered. But the final knife to her soul was Jack's next words. "Enough, Hannah," he said, his voice cold. "You're embarrassing us. Go home." The words echoed in her ears. The man who had once knelt before her, vowing to love her forever, now dismissed her like an inconvenience. Tears burned her eyes as whispers spread among the crowd watching the scene. She felt suffocated, humiliated, utterly alone. With one last glance at the man she had loved, Hannah turned and ran, clutching her belly as if to protect the life growing inside her. She didn't stop until she reached her apartment, locking the door behind her. Sliding down to the floor, sobs racked her body. The man she had built a life with, the man she had once trusted with her heart, had betrayed her in the most public, unforgivable way. There was no coming back from this. And in that moment, Hannah knew she had to leave. Not just for herself, but for the child she carried. Jack Hawkins had made his choice. Now, she would make hers. 3 years had passed since that fateful day in the mall, but for Jack Hawkins, it might as well have been yesterday. Life had moved on. He had moved on, or at least, that's what he told himself. His empire had only grown, his name becoming even more respected in the business world. He had everything he had ever wanted. Power, wealth, influence. And yet, something was missing. He felt it in the silence of his penthouse, in the way the laughter at his victory parties never quite reached his heart. Melissa, the woman he had left Hannah for, had long since lost her appeal. Their relationship had been exciting at first, thrilling, even, but over time, it had become just another transaction. Another deal. Another hollow success. Jack never allowed himself to think about Hannah, at least not for long. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, he wondered. Did she ever look back? Did she ever miss him? Where had she gone? Then one afternoon, everything changed. Jack was in his office, closing a deal that would make headlines, when his assistant entered, looking hesitant. "Mr. Hawkins, there's a call for you." It's from Boston General Hospital. Jack frowned. I don't know anyone in Boston. The assistant shifted uncomfortably. Sir, it's about Hannah Thompson. The world tilted slightly. Jack's grip tightened on his pen. It had been years since he'd heard that name. Hannah. His mind raced. Was she hurt? Why would a hospital be calling him about her? He took the call, his voice sharper than intended. This is Jack Hawkins. Mr. Hawkins, came a calm, professional voice. This is Dr. Martinez from Boston General. I'm calling regarding a patient named Sophie Thompson. She's listed in our records as your daughter. The words hit Jack like a sledgehammer. My what? His breath caught. Your daughter, sir, the doctor repeated. Sophie Thompson. She's 3 years old and has been diagnosed with a congenital heart condition. She needs surgery, and we require your authorization. Jack couldn't speak. His mind refused to process what he had just heard. A daughter? Hannah had been pregnant when she left? For 3 years, he had a child, and he had never known? Mr. Hawkins, the doctor prompted. Jack swallowed hard, his heart pounding. I'll be there. He hung up, his hands shaking. For the first time in years, business no longer mattered. Hours later, Jack was on a private jet to Boston, his mind a chaotic mess of emotions. He felt anger, confusion, guilt. But above all, an overwhelming need to see Hannah. To see Sophie. As the plane touched down, reality set in. What if Hannah refused to let him see their daughter? Would Sophie even want to meet him? Steeling himself, Jack arrived at the hospital. The sterile scent filled his nostrils as he walked through the halls, his expensive suit feeling suffocating in the cold, clinical environment. Then, he saw her. Hannah. She stood at the end of the hallway, speaking to a nurse. His breath hitched. She looked different. Stronger. Wiser. More tired. But still breathtaking. And beside her, gripping her hand, was a little girl. Jack's heart nearly stopped. Sophie. Even from a distance, he could see it, she was his. The same deep blue eyes, the same sharp features. But there was so much of Hannah in her, too. Before he could think, before he could plan what to say, Sophie turned and spotted him. Their eyes met. For a moment, time stood still. Then, the little girl tugged on Hannah's sleeve and pointed. Hannah turned. When her gaze landed on Jack, shock flashed across her face. Jack, she whispered. And just like that, the past came crashing back. Jack took a shaky step forward, his voice hoarse. I came as soon as I heard. Hannah instinctively pulled Sophie closer, her protective instincts kicking in. How did you find out? The hospital called me, Jack admitted, his throat tight. I didn't know, Hannah. I swear, I didn't know. Her eyes searched his, looking for lies. Jack held her gaze, willing her to believe him. Let's talk, she said finally. In private. Hannah led him to an empty waiting room, leaving Sophie with the nurse. The second the door closed, her emotions exploded. How dare you show up now, she hissed. After everything? Jack took a deep breath. Hannah, if I had known, I would have. You would have what, Jack? She interrupted, her voice raw. You humiliated me. You made me feel worthless. And now, after all these years, you think you can just walk back into our lives? Jack clenched his jaw, taking the verbal punches he knew he deserved. I was an idiot, he admitted. I made the worst mistake of my life. But now, I want to do the right thing." Hannah studied him, the anger in her eyes slowly giving way to exhaustion. "Sophie is sick," she said softly. "She needs surgery. That's why we're here." The words made Jack's stomach churn. His daughter, his flesh and blood, was fighting for her life, and he had been completely oblivious. "I'll pay for everything," he said immediately. "Whatever she needs." For a moment, Hannah looked like she wanted to argue. But then, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. A knock at the door interrupted them. The nurse entered, leading Sophie inside. Jack knelt down to her level, his heart hammering. "Hi," he said softly. I'm your dad." Sophie studied him curiously, then gave a small, shy smile. "Hi," she whispered back. Jack felt something inside him crack open. He tentatively held out his hand, unsure if she would take it. After a moment, Sophie reached out and wrapped her tiny fingers around his. A silent promise passed between them. Jack Hawkins had missed 3 years of his daughter's life. But he wouldn't miss another second. Jack Hawkins had always been a man of action. When he wanted something, he got it. Deals, mergers, power, none of it had ever been out of reach. But now, standing in a hospital room, watching his 3-year-old daughter sleep, he felt completely powerless. Sophie looked so small in the hospital bed, her tiny chest rising and falling steadily, her curly blonde hair spread across the pillow. The reality of the situation hit him hard. His daughter was sick, and he had missed everything. Her first words, her first steps, the sound of her laughter echoing through a home he should have been part of. He turned to Hannah, who sat beside Sophie, stroking her daughter's hand absent-mindedly. She looked exhausted but strong. She had been doing this alone. And that realization crushed him. "I should have been here," Jack murmured, barely recognizing his own voice. Hannah didn't look at him. "But you weren't." Her words were simple, but they carried years of pain. Jack exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to fix this, Hannah." She finally met his gaze, her eyes unreadable. "I don't think you can." That hurt. More than it should have. But he couldn't blame her. Jack had spent the last few days at the hospital, trying to be present, trying to help. He signed all the forms, covered the cost of Sophie's treatment without a second thought, and made sure she had the best care possible. But money wasn't enough. Sophie didn't know him. She was cautious around him, hesitant, as if unsure of who he really was. And Hannah. Hannah was a fortress. One evening, as Jack sat in the hospital cafeteria, sipping coffee he barely tasted, a familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "She likes stories, you know." Jack looked up to see Hannah standing beside him, arms crossed. "What?" he asked, caught off guard. "Sophie," Hannah said, sitting across from him. "She loves bedtime stories. If you want to connect with her, start there." Jack stared at her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you." That night, he brought a book to her hospital room. When he sat beside her bed, Sophie eyed him warily. "Can I read to you?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. Jack opened the book and started reading, his voice careful, steady. As the story unfolded, Sophie's little fingers wrapped around his hand. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. It was a small victory. But it meant everything. Days turned into weeks, and Jack became a constant presence. He took time off from his company, ignoring the chaos it caused back in New York. For the first time in his life, business wasn't his priority. Sophie was. He learned what made her laugh, what food she liked, what songs she hummed under her breath. And little by little, she began to trust him. One afternoon, while Hannah was out running errands, Jack sat with Sophie in the hospital playroom. She was coloring a picture, her brows furrowed in concentration. "Can I see?" Jack asked. Sophie held up her drawing, a little girl standing between two tall figures. "A family." Jack's throat tightened. "Is that us?" Sophie nodded. "You and Mommy." Jack looked at her carefully. "And do you want that?" She bit her lip, then nodded again. Jack exhaled slowly. He had spent years chasing after the wrong things. And now, the most important thing in his life was sitting right in front of him, drawing a picture of the family he had almost lost. "I want that too, sweetheart," he whispered. Later that evening, Jack found Hannah in the hospital garden, sitting alone on a bench. "She's letting me in," he said, sitting beside her. Hannah sighed, rubbing her temples. "Yeah. She's always wanted a dad." Jack turned to her. "And what about you? What do you want, Hannah?" She let out a bitter laugh. "It doesn't matter what I want, Jack. What matters is Sophie." Jack shook his head. "No. You matter too." For the first time, Hannah looked at him, really looked at him. "I don't know if I can trust you." Jack nodded. "I don't expect you to. But I want to earn it. Not just for Sophie, for you too." She hesitated, her defenses still up. But there was something in her eyes. A flicker of something she had buried long ago. Hope. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "What is this?" Hannah asked. "Funding," he said simply. "For your school." Hannah's brows furrowed. "Jack, I don't need your money." "It's not about money," he said. "It's about making sure you don't have to do everything alone anymore." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you." It was just 2 words. But for the first time, it felt like she was letting him in. The day of Sophie's surgery arrived. Jack and Hannah sat together outside the operating room, waiting in agonizing silence. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. Jack's fingers trembled slightly as he rubbed his palms together. "I can't lose her, Hannah." Hannah placed her hand over his. "Neither can I." For the first time in years, they weren't enemies. They weren't strangers. They were parents, bound by their love for their child. Hours later, the surgeon emerged. The surgery was a success. Hannah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears welling in her eyes. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, silent gratitude washing over him. When they were finally allowed into Sophie's room, she was groggy but smiling. Jack sat beside her, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Hey, brave girl." Sophie smiled sleepily. "You stayed." Jack's heart clenched. "Of course, sweetheart," he whispered. "I'm never leaving again." Hannah watched, something shifting inside her. Maybe, just maybe, Jack Hawkins wasn't the same man who had broken her heart. Maybe he was becoming the man she and Sophie needed. Jack Hawkins had spent years building his empire, one that was fueled by ambition, relentless work, and a belief that success was measured by power and wealth. But as he sat in Sophie's hospital room, watching her sleep peacefully after her surgery, he realized that everything he had built was meaningless compared to this. This tiny girl, his daughter, was more valuable than every skyscraper, every deal, and every dollar he had ever earned. He had almost lost her before he even knew she existed. And now, he would never let that happen again. Over the next few weeks, Jack stayed in Boston, dedicating himself to being the father he had never been. Sophie's recovery was slow, but she was strong. She smiled more now, reaching for his hand when she felt scared, letting him tuck her in at night. It wasn't lost on Jack that Hannah was watching him closely. She was still guarded, hesitant to trust that this change in him was real. And she had every right to be. One afternoon, Jack met with his lawyers in a quiet cafe near the hospital. "I want to step down," he said, his voice firm. The lawyers looked at him in shock. "Step down, sir?" Jack nodded. "I'm leaving the company. Sell my shares, liquidate whatever assets are necessary. I want half of the proceeds to go into Sophie's medical trust, and the rest," he hesitated, then continued, "the rest goes into funding Hannah's school." His team exchanged uneasy glances. "Mr. Hawkins, this is your empire. If you do this, you'll be walking away from billions." Jack exhaled, looking down at the cup of coffee in front of him. "I spent years chasing the wrong things," he admitted. "It's time to do something that actually matters." And for the first time in his life, he truly meant it. Later that day, Jack found Hannah sitting on the front steps of the school she had built from the ground up. The school was a modest building but full of warmth and life. The sound of children laughing echoed from inside, their joy reminding Jack of what was truly important. Hannah looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Jack sat beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. "I wanted to see the place." He glanced around, taking in the colorful murals painted by the kids, the small garden in the corner where students had planted flowers. "This is incredible, Hannah," he said genuinely. "You've built something amazing." She let out a quiet laugh. "It's not an empire, but it's enough." Jack turned to her, his voice soft. "Maybe empires aren't what matter." Hannah looked at him carefully, as if trying to read his soul. "What's going on, Jack?" He took a deep breath. "I stepped down. From the company. I sold everything." Her eyes widened. "What?" "I'm done chasing money and power," he admitted. "I set up a trust for Sophie's medical care. And I put the rest into funding this school." Hannah's lips parted slightly in shock. "Jack, You don't have to say anything," he cut in. I want to help. I want to be here. Not just for Sophie, but for you too." She looked away, blinking rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears. Jack reached for her hand, hesitating before gently placing his over hers. "I know I don't deserve your trust. And I won't ask you to forgive me overnight. But I'm not that man anymore, Hannah." For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, she whispered, "I can see that." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a declaration of love. But it was a start. Days passed, and Jack continued to show up, not just for Sophie, but for Hannah, for the school, for the life he had once walked away from. One evening, as he was helping Sophie color at the kitchen table, Hannah stood in the doorway, watching them. Something about the sight of Jack sitting there, no suit, no business calls, just him being present, made something in her heart shift. He had changed. And maybe, just maybe, there was a future where they could be a family again. One night, after putting Sophie to bed, Jack found Hannah sitting on the porch. He hesitated before stepping outside. "Mind if I join you?" She shook her head, and he sat beside her. For a while, they just sat in silence, listening to the night. Then, Hannah spoke. "You really sold everything?" Jack nodded. "Yeah. And it's funny, I thought I'd feel like I lost everything. but for the first time, I feel like I have something real." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Jack," she hesitated. "I never thought I'd say this, but thank you." A small smile tugged at his lips. "For what?" "For staying. For choosing something other than yourself this time." Jack reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'll keep choosing you. And Sophie. Every time." Hannah didn't pull away. And for the first time in years, Jack dared to hope. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. Sophie's health improved day by day, her laughter filling the house with warmth. Jack had become a constant presence, not just a visitor, not just an outsider, but a father. He took Sophie to school every morning, picked her up in the afternoons, and read her stories before bed. He helped out at Hannah's school, using his connections to bring in funding, new books, and better resources for the children. It was a different life from the one he had once lived, but for the first time, Jack didn't miss his old world. The boardrooms, the high-stakes deals, the late-night parties, they felt empty now. This was real. One evening, as the sun set, Jack and Hannah sat on the front porch, watching Sophie chase fireflies in the yard. "She's happy," Jack murmured, watching their daughter with a soft smile. Hannah nodded. "She is both of her parents now." Jack turned to her, his expression serious. "And what about you, Hannah? Are you happy?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "I don't know," she admitted. "For so long, I told myself I had to do everything alone. That I couldn't rely on anyone. Especially not you." Jack swallowed hard. "I understand." She finally met his gaze. "But you've changed, Jack. You didn't just come back, you stayed. You proved me wrong." Jack reached for her hand, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. "And I'll keep proving it, every day, for as long as you let me." Hannah exhaled softly. "I don't know if I'm ready." Jack smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "That's okay. I'll wait." She studied him for a long moment before finally leaning her head against his shoulder. And for the first time in years, Jack Hawkins knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. A new beginning. A second chance. A family.